Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're just going to give it a couple minutes for folks to log on before we get started, but we're glad you're here. For those of you that just logged on, I'm seeing a lot of familiar names and a lot of new names, which is very exciting. We're just going to give it one more minute for a few more folks to log on, and then we'll get started. This is our amazing lineup for today. So if you haven't checked out these people and their organizations, please do. All right. Thank you all for joining us today. Welcome to the Water Equity and Climate Resilience Caucus briefing on our growing national water affordability crisis and the need for federal action. My name is Yasmin Zarapur. I'm the Director of Water Equity and Climate Resilience at PolicyLink, and I have the great honor of co-chairing the Water Equity and Climate Resilience Caucus, which I'll describe in a little bit, which I co-chair with the amazing Colette Pichon-Battle from Taproot Earth. So we have several speakers affiliated with the Water Equity and Climate Resilience Caucus, as you can see on the screen, that are lined up to provide an overview of the water affordability crisis and the need for a permanent national low-income program. And we'll spend the first hour sort of hearing from them and then leave about 25 minutes for any questions. If you do have any questions that Sade just mentioned in the chat, please go ahead and drop them in the Q&A box, and we'll all see them on our side. I think we'll get started with special remarks from two great champions for water affordability and access issues. We'll start with remarks from Representative Tlaib from Michigan and then Senator Padilla from California.
Hello, water warriors. As you all know, water is life and water is a human right. And we're going to keep saying it until it's real for everyone. I want to thank you all for being here to continue organizing and fighting for real permanent national water affordability. We are also incredibly indebted to our water justice champions. Because of you, in recent years, we have seen some important steps towards delivering on the promise of safe, affordable water for all. We established a low-income household water affordability program during the pandemic and took a step towards ending water shutoffs. We know more work is needed. We've also appropriated billions to replace lead service lines. And because of you and your guidance, I helped found the bipartisan Get the Lead Out Caucus to organize our members of Congress around water issues. In Detroit, folks like Monica Lewis Patrick made it impossible for the city to keep ignoring water affordability. And they introduced a citywide affordability plan, even if there's still room for improvement, as you all will hear. But as you all know, we still have so much work to do. We need a permanent and fully funded federal water affordability program that ensures that not a single person in our country ever has to suffer without water in their home. We need tens of billions more to replace every single lead service line. We need to target those resources to communities with the highest need. We need to rebuild infrastructure and guard against the threats of corporate polluters that pose a threat to our water sources. We have to face these fights together. Here in Detroit, we're a city of water warriors. We have many of the mothers of this movement right here. We know that the struggles people are facing firsthand because we've seen them have to rely on bottled water to drink and a neighbor's hose to bathe. We have been on the front lines to know what real affordability looks like. The policymakers have to be guided by the experts on the ground who know what's really going on. We have to center the experience of our frontline residents, our neighbors, as we build the policies that will allow everyone in our communities to thrive. I want you all to know that we are winning. We are changing how politicians in Washington think about water. Along with Congresswoman Cori Bush, Congressman Jamal Bowman, we just introduced a resolution that declares that water and other utilities are human right, and that every person has a right to water that is clean, safe, and affordable. We are fighting the privatization, that the corporate greed and those folks that are trying to, again, stop our movement. We are showing our country that the basics of a good life are non-negotiable. So I want to thank you all again. I know we need more direct funding, not loans, that we need to talk about water affordability in a more impactful way. But I want to thank you all for giving credibility to the work I'm doing on your behalf. It is an honor to be part of this movement with all of you. My door is always open to you. And again, I will see you in the streets.
Hi, I'm Senator Alex Padilla, and it's an honor to join members of the Water Equity and Climate Resilience Caucus today. And it's fitting that we're here 1 week after a critical election to issue a call to action. Because when it comes to reliable access to clean water, millions of Americans are relying on us to pick up the fight. Access to safe, affordable drinking water is a fundamental human right. In a nation with the strongest economy in the world, no child should have to fear that their tap water might be poisoned by the very lead pipes leading water into their home. And no parent should have to wonder whether they can afford this month's bill for something as basic as clean water. And yet, even in California, a leader in the fight for access to affordable water, 1 million people can't turn to their tap for clean water. Rising water costs over the past decade have meant families are seeing monthly water bills skyrocket. The COVID-19 pandemic only made reliable access that much harder to come by, leading to 1 in 10 California households with unpaid water bills totaling $1 billion. Even in this day and age, too often it's communities of color and low-income families bearing the brunt of rising water costs and the constant threat of shutdown notices in the mail and wells running dry. And far too many children are starting off life facing instant risks to their health because of it. We have to do better. And with your help, we're starting to make the necessary change. Now in Congress, I introduced the Lead-Free Drinking Water for All Act to authorize billions of dollars to mitigate lead contamination in drinking water across the country. I was so proud to support the bipartisan infrastructure law, which is the single largest federal investment in water infrastructure in history. This means $55 billion for critical water infrastructure projects, removing harmful lead and PFAS forever chemicals from the water that Americans depend on. I was also proud to help authorize a permanent and universal water bill assistance program to help make water more affordable for rural and low-income communities. So we're making progress, but now we need to make sure that we fund this new program, because when it comes to something as fundamental as clean water, we can't let up. And as the existential threat of the climate crisis persists, it means longer droughts, more catastrophic wildfires, and man-made pollution that disproportionately impacts communities of color. So we still have a ways to go, not just to keep water access affordable, but to save the planet for our children and future generations. I'm so grateful to have you all alongside me in that fight. Thank you for all that you do to improve the lives of Americans all across our country. I know that together we can look out for our neighbors, we can lend a helping hand to those in need, and we can start to build a more compassionate America where water is a human right and not a privilege. Thank you.
We really appreciate Senator Padilla and Representative Tlaib's continued support, both on continuing to raise the need for water affordability and the need for water assistance, and on supporting the Water Equity and Climate Resilience Caucus. As you heard in both of their remarks, this isn't a hypothetical problem. This is really affecting a lot of families around the country, and we do strongly believe that everyone should have access to clean and affordable water. So I've mentioned the Water Equity and Climate Resilience Caucus a few times. Who are we? We are a national network of nearly 100 members and allies that center communities of color and low-income communities in advocating for equitable federal policy at the intersection of water, climate, and justice. You can see our website on the screen and we'll send it out in a little bit. Without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce our incredible speakers. So first we'll hear from Monica Lewis Patrick of We the People of Detroit on challenges that families in Michigan are facing. Then we'll turn it over to Julian Gonzalez of Earth Justice, who will give us some background on the national scope of the problem and the impetus behind standing up a temporary water assistance program through HHS. Then we'll turn it to Scott Berry from U.S. Water Alliance and Tony Parrott from the Louisville and Jefferson County Metropolitan Sewer District on utility support for a national water assistance program. And finally, we'll hear from Kyle Jones from the Community Water Center on efforts to stand up a state-based water assistance program in California. Before I turn it over to Monica, we'll play one more short video to hear from residents in both Michigan and California who have been struggling to pay their rising water bills.
Mi recibo de agua me sale en esa cantidad, 200 y algo cada 2 meses.
Our water bills here are over $100 a month for our residents.
Regularmente de 100 a 140 mensual.
Yo podría decir que en mi hogar destinamos aproximadamente un 15% de nuestros ingresos para pagar la factura del agua.
Y pues ese aumento está pasando a perjudicar a todos nuestros bolsillos porque somos, como ya lo dijimos, de bajos recursos.
Water insecurity is a public health crisis. The structural racism that has allowed water insecurity to persist is a public health crisis.
Y además de eso tengo que comprar agua embotellada para poder consumir porque obviamente el agua es de mala calidad.
Farmers are exploiting our water and overusing dangerous chemicals.
I mean, some people are paying $60 to $120 a month, and that's even with water you can't even drink or cook with. So that's a big chunk out of people's pocket to have water and not be able to really use it.
Somos una familia de 6 personas, las cuales considero yo que deberíamos tener un precio mucho más asequible.
We've had problems with water contamination for years, and we need help for our residents to pay their water bills.
Policymakers, all policymakers at the local, state, and federal level have a basic job to do. Implement water affordability laws that ensure the most vulnerable have access to clean, safe, and affordable water.
Thank you for those voices. Miss Monica Lewis Patrick, can I turn it over to you?
Thank you, Dr. Z. Every time I hear those kinds of testimonies, it rocks me to my core that we are still finding it necessary to advocate and plead for a sustained pathway to clean, safe, and affordable water for residents across these United States. My organization is a small organization here in the city of Detroit, We the People of Detroit, but we consider ourselves committed to doing a mighty work for the human right to water. And part of that work came out of multiple crises of shutting water off with no pathway to being able to restore it or sustain it. One of the critical pieces that came up for us during the global pandemic was the fact that as water was being turned off, we had to plead to have water not only restored, but then to put in place a moratorium. We are pleased because of the advocacy of not only folks on this line, but those across the country and then those frontline groups here in the city of Detroit. We were able to successfully get our local government at the city level and also at the state level to implement some of the first moratoriums in the nation. But we also found from research done by Dr. Jan Reed at the University of Michigan, along with other experts, that there has been decades of water service affordability issues, not only across these United States, but specifically in the Great Lakes state of Michigan. And then what they were able to do by examining across the state of Michigan, not just in urban areas, but looking at suburban and rural communities as well, that over the last 4 decades, water and sewer bills across the United States, including Michigan, have increased at a higher rate than any other basic need except for healthcare. This has resulted in a dramatic increase in the proportion of household incomes dedicated to water and wastewater services for Michigan residents. The most important impact is on the economically vulnerable members of our community. We find that many times people are having to choose whether to buy medicine, food, or to pay other bills because they're competing with the ever-increasing cost of their water bills. The most important issue that we're facing right now is the fact that we have no sustained plan for being able to ensure that people can maintain access to water. Part of what the assessment was able to demonstrate is that in the Midwest, water bills for households in the lowest 20th percentile have risen over 433% since 1986. But we haven't seen incomes increase at that same pace. Incomes have only risen to the tune of 241%. So that on its face is leaving multiple families strapped economically with the burden of the ever-increasing cost of water. We also have seen in our rural Michigan communities that residents are challenged with the repairs that are needed for private wells. They're finding that there's an uptick to the cost to address their subtanks, and that many of them are looking at 20% of the wells and 27% of the subtanks in this state being out of compliance. The 21st Century Infrastructure Commission in 2016 estimated that it would be an annual cost of $20 million to support those unable to afford septic tank replacement cost. So what I'm saying to you is that as a person representing the great city of Detroit, a place that is known historically for not being able to address the ever-increasing cost of water, this is not just an urban issue, this is an urban, suburban, and rural issue. And we lift that because we cannot allow anyone to divide us geographically or pit us against others in our states and across our nation. We also wanted to lift up that water utilities themselves are strapped, that many of them have only a few personnel that is servicing those water institutions. And what we find is there is a great need to invest in utilities to give them the tools that they need in order to make sure that they can apply the instruments necessary to make water affordable. Some of the areas that we talk about that we need their participation is in data collection, being able to demonstrate how many people are shut off, how many people are restored, being able to make sure that there are greater efficiencies, making sure that we are investing in young people to ensure that Justice 40 is actualized and not trivialized as some form of an affirmative action plan. The next one, please. I think it's important that you hear not only from me as a person that lives in the city of Detroit in the state of Michigan, but that you hear from those folks that are most impacted by the inability to afford the ever-increasing cost of water. Here we have an amazing community member by the name of Sonia Bennett. Sonia Bennett has not only been dealing with the tragedy of not being able to afford her water, but she's also faced foreclosure because of the ever-increasing cost of water being tacked on as debt and then forced into foreclosure because she could not afford that increasing cost. The next voice you'll hear is Sonia Bennett.
I, again, am here today as not just an advocate, but as a mother who has been in the position of having to watch my children wash up from hose water and bottled water because I could not afford to keep that high-ass water bill. I am here to ask the water company, the city of Detroit, the organizations that work here, the press, everybody, to stand with us and make sure that this 85% black city does not leave families without water. Water is a human right. It is your right. It is my right. And it should be affordable. And it should not be a burden on poor black and brown people in this city. Thank you.
Wow. And so it is my hope that we today can turn a page in shutting water off, that this is an opportunity for us to lift up some of the amazing concepts that are being offered through the LIWAP plan. We believe that the plan is a great start in getting a metrics in terms of what is happening on the ground. And one of the things that we've been able to move forward with the Detroit Water and Sewage Department is a plan called the Lifeline Plan. It is not affordability, but it is a very progressive idea around piecing together all of the pots of assistance that is available to the city right now. What we see is that there is a distinction that we must make, that assistance is a patch quilt, it's a Band-Aid. It gives us some temporary relief for those persons that may have a temporary emergency. But then we have a population in our communities across this nation that, because of the fact that they find themselves impoverished and without a way to be able to garner other resources, we must, as the federal government, working in concert with state government, create that pathway. And so we know that the DWSD Lifeline Plan doesn't go far enough in terms of securing that, but with a sustained resource arm of funding, we can make the Lifeline Plan shift from water assistance to water affordability. We also believe that this offers an opportunity for the water department to be more transparent, to be more forthright. It offers an opportunity for us as community to be more collaborative in helping the utility get the community information that it needs so that it can get the proper funding to scale up to service what the community's water expectations are. And so what I am hoping that happens out of this meeting today is that we will begin the process of ensuring that every American, every household has a pathway to clean, safe, and affordable water. Part of that means addressing household capacity to pay for water and sewer services under a variety of hardship scenarios, water arrearages, long-term poverty, short-term economic hardships, private wells, septic systems, economic vulnerability in terms of communities. Prohibit water shutoffs for economically vulnerable households. Address gaps in utility capacity statewide and prioritize assistance for utilities and communities with the least financial feasibility. Address the lack of comparable utility level financial data at a statewide level so that we can monitor it at a federal level. And then the last thing I'll say is require utilities to implement meaningful and significant community engagement in water and sewer system planning and decision making. This is what we believe will change the trajectory of the country. This is what we believe will keep water clean, safe, and affordable. Thank you so much for my time.
Thank you, Monica, for lending your voice and Sonia's voice to this discussion. For folks in the audience, again, if you have specific questions to the speakers, please do put in your question to the Q&A chat. Next, we'll turn it over to Julian Gonzalez from Earth Justice. Julian.
Thanks. Can y'all hear me? Great. You can just load the bullet points on this slide. Yeah, it's a couple of them. Thanks. Hi, everybody. I'm Julian Gonzalez. I'm Senior Legislative Counsel for Earth Justice here in DC, and I have the pleasure of working with folks from all over the country trying to find a way to solve these really difficult problems. So I get to work with really amazing advocates like Ms. Monica. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the federal scope of this problem and what the federal, what Congress and what agencies have done lately to attempt to make some progress on this. So as you heard from Ms. Monica, the water affordability crisis is at its heart a human rights crisis, and it's really born from aging infrastructure and decades of disinvestment in different communities. So our infrastructure is old in this country, to put it bluntly, and is unable to handle a lot of the treatment tasks that we're faced with, right? In addition to pollutants that have been around for a long time, you have emerging pollutants like PFAS, and all of that costs money to treat. And those costs get passed down to customers all over the country. The data backs this up and shows that this is true, especially in rural and low-income areas and places where people of color live, places that have been disinvested in throughout the years. So without federal investment, these rates are going to continue to get worse. Ms. Monica showed you some of the data behind that, and the costs of water have risen dramatically over the last decade, and that has not slowed down. So without federal investment to help stem that tide, and without federal targeting to ensure that the communities that are facing that are dealing with the brunt of this crisis receive help, we're not going to slow this problem down. So there really is a big role for the federal government to play. We saw some action on that finally, thankfully, recently with the bipartisan infrastructure law that Senator Padilla mentioned in his remarks, which provided really an unprecedented investment, $55 billion in water infrastructure. Most of that went to the state revolving funds, which are housed within EPA and are the largest source of water infrastructure funding in the federal government, which is awesome. Most of the money will be released in the form of loans. That's how the state revolving funds work. And those are helpful, but many communities can't afford loans. Like I mentioned, a lot of these communities don't have high incomes, don't have a big rate base. Sometimes they're sparsely populated. So they don't have access to the main source of water infrastructure funding, which is a huge problem. And even though that legislation did a lot, providing $55 billion to the state revolving funds, many other important sources of water infrastructure funding that are more accessible or have different areas of focus, like USDA's rural development programs, which are the second biggest government funding source for water infrastructure, didn't get new money. So we have to continue to press members of Congress to really fund water infrastructure to help deal with this water affordability crisis at its core. As you can see from the third bullet, this is a really daunting task. The estimates are huge. You're talking over $1 trillion over 20 years. EPA's own estimates are not that far off from the estimate you see here from the U.S. Water Alliance. So it's the funding that we got over the last year with the bipartisan infrastructure law is really important, and it's going to mean that people's lives are meaningfully improved. But if we want everybody to share in that benefit, we need continued investment. You can go to the next slide. This is just a visualization of it from the U.S. Water Alliance of how federal contribution to infrastructure spending has really plummeted since the 70s. The stream, the blue stream here is water infrastructure spending, and the other ones are aviation spending. That's the one that looks like clouds, and highway spending, which is the little road here. And all three have decreased, but you can see that water infrastructure contributions from the federal government have decreased the most, and that has left states and local communities, cities, towns, to really bear the brunt of the costs. And those communities are often strapped, and states often do not have surpluses of money these days. So it's really not a sustainable formula. You can go to the next slide. And let's get these bullet points up. Okay, great. So this slide is a little bit about what we've done. Oops, sorry, there's my doggy. So at the beginning of the pandemic, a broad alliance of justice organizations like We the People of Detroit really banded together to put a spotlight on water access and insecurity. This crisis has existed long before the pandemic, but pre-vaccine, as we all remember, thorough and consistent hand washing was the best defense we had against COVID. And households were getting their water shut off in spite of this because of their inability to pay water bills, which is a human rights violation, right? Like, there's no other way to put that. It's an unconscionable practice. And that struck a chord. Even though it was known to lots of folks like Ms. Monica, there are lots of people, both in DC and around the country, who were unaware that stuff like that was happening. And I think media picked up on that thanks to the efforts of lots of different community groups that were really making the rounds on everything from Twitter to podcasts to TV shows to newspapers, you name it. And that translated to attention. And part of that attention was the authorization of an emergency program. That's the second bullet here, the Low-Income Household Water Assistance Program, which was designed to be stood up quickly at HHS because HHS already housed similar assistance programs for energy. So in theory, they had some of the infrastructure which existed to get something like this, to provide some assistance to folks up and running in the middle of a pandemic, which is a really difficult task. That was the first federal water assistance program that we've seen. So it was a really big win, but we can't stop there. You know, there's still lots of people dealing with this, and we need a long-term federal permanent program to address this problem, because like we've all said, it's not really going away. The third bullet here, you'll see Congress also authorized the federal pilot program at EPA. It hasn't been funded yet, but this 40-city pilot program, the idea behind it is that EPA is familiar with the way our water utilities are, the way they work, what grant programs they take advantage for, things like combined sewer overflows, separate sewer systems. They're familiar with the state revolving funds. They enforce the Clean Water Act and Safe Drinking Water Act, which imposes direct responsibilities on water utilities throughout the country. So there was that effort as well, which was yet another acknowledgement that people in DC realized we need to act on this. But like I said, we need to go further. We need a permanent program, and it needs to be funded in order to make the progress that that we really need and that communities deserve. You can load these. I talked about some of this just now, but climate change is another huge factor here, right? We see it in places like Jackson, where increased super floods that are climate driven are stressing water systems even more and making the water affordability crisis worse. The LIHWAP program that was created in the pandemic is really helpful, but it was built to work fast and to not last forever. It was built to be a program for the duration of the pandemic as an emergency. Most of these 50,000 water systems throughout the country are small, and they don't even have the resources in terms of money or staff to implement a full-blown water assistance program. And it's situations like that where it's the federal government's responsibility to step in and fill the gap to help folks out who live in those places, because it shouldn't be up to what zip code you're in as to whether you can access water assistance. And, you know, EPA's continued, they've begun to talk about these issues. Administrator Regan has testified before Congress about water affordability. So we're beginning to see signals from EPA and other agencies about the importance of solving this problem soon and taking action at the congressional level. And we need to continue to beat the drum so that there's more of that. And the last bullet here, my last point, is that this is really common sense if you think about it. There's assistance programs for all sorts of other things, for heating, for electricity. And a water program is something that we really need until we can truly make water affordable. So we need a both and approach right now from our friends in Congress. Thanks.
Thanks, Julian. Thanks to those that are putting their questions in the Q&A function. We're getting a few more. All right, next we are going to turn it over to Scott Berry from the U.S. Water Alliance and Tony Parrott, who's the executive director of the Louisville and Jefferson County Metropolitan Sewer District, to speak a little bit from the utility perspective on why we need federal commitment.
Thanks, Yasmin. And so in addition to the national temporary solution that Julian was just talking about, many drinking water and wastewater utilities have voluntarily created customer assistance programs on their own that help people that can't afford their water bills. And in many places, these have been effective ways to help people afford water and sewer services. And you heard Monica just a few minutes ago talk about the DWSD Lifeline plan, which is just starting to get going. And you're going to hear next from a utility that's worked really hard to reach people and make its services affordable. But these programs, while being good programs, can often struggle to get services to everyone eligible, either because of low enrollment or limited funding or both. And scaling that solution across every utility, water and wastewater utility in the country is tremendously difficult. Like in many states, state policies can be barriers, potentially blocking customer assistance plan implementation or limiting the type of scope. And water system fragmentation, as always, is a huge barrier to scaling scaling these types of programs across all different kinds of utilities. And I want to show you a series of maps put together by EJ Water, which is one of the Alliance's member utilities that would help illustrate this issue. So most major utilities like natural gas, electricity, TV, internet, cell phones, et cetera, they all cover large swaths of customers over many different kinds of geographic areas. So in this map of natural gas utilities across the lower 48, you see them pretty spread out, maybe 600 or 700 of these utilities. Next one. And this one is of electric utilities, but almost every water utility is embedded in a local government. Every city, town in America, et cetera, needs water first and foremost to function. So while there may be 600 or 700 natural gas utilities, and here you see about 1,200 electric utilities, there are over 50,000 drinking water utilities across the country. It's an absolute ton of different actors in the water space. This is one of the reasons why the LIWAP program, which is sort of designed by LIHEAP, struggled a little bit because it was a program designed to work with natural gas and electric utilities being used for water utilities, which are much, much bigger in scope. And so of, those 50,000 plus water and sewer utilities, 90% of them serve populations of less than 10,000 people. And according to a survey by the Rural Community Assistance Partnership done a few years ago, 43% of those small utilities have just one or no full-time staff. They may have volunteer operators or part-time staff. So that's a high number of lower capacity utilities in the sector that may not have the capability of instituting these sorts of customer assistance programs because they take a lot to stand up and fund and administer. So you've heard about the need. You're going to hear more from Tony in just a second about how utilities are tackling the issue. And you've heard about the temporary solution enacted by Congress, but ultimately what is needed is a permanent national low-income water assistance program. So I'm going to turn it over to Tony and he's going to give you the utility perspective on this.
Thank you, Scott, and thank you, everyone. It has been spoken earlier that, the federal funding or federal assistance supporting the water industry has declined over the last 40 years, and it has exacerbated the situation that we are in now. And the American Society of Civil Engineers also has graded our drinking water systems and our wastewater systems across America as a C- or a D-. And so what that tells us is that our infrastructure is failing. And as our infrastructure fails from a public utility perspective, and with the decline of federal assistance, replacing those assets is very critical. And also, when you think about the emerging contaminants and what that impacts the operation of a utility, and without the federal assistance on the capital side, it is causing the local ratepayers to bear the burden of aging infrastructure, emerging contaminants, and also climate change. And so one thing that is very critical is that, and we found that out during the pandemic, is that water is becoming unaffordable. And so from a utility perspective, we have done everything to try to make sure, particularly during the pandemic, that we could continue to provide service without moratoriums, continue to provide safe, quality drinking water, to make sure that folks had opportunities either to pay their bill or get on payment plans. And here in Louisville, what we tried to do, working with our drinking water partner, Louisville Water, we tried to come up with multiple ways that we could maximize the amount of funding that were available for customer assistance. And whether that was the COVID relief funds, the ARPA funds, the funds that we already have for our senior citizens discounts, and also an emergency wastewater rate assistance fund that we developed locally in Louisville during the pandemic, and continuing that going forward. But even with the introduction of LIWAP, with $1.6 million from LIWAP coming into our city, essentially that was exhausted within three months. And so basically you have this perpetual cycle of folks getting on payment plans, but yet when they get their next bill the next month, they're not able to pay their bill. And so it's becoming an issue where, as utilities, we are trying everything we can to provide assistance. I am very familiar with the program that Gary Brown at Detroit has rolled out, which I think is a good model for all of us to take a look at. But what we're trying to do and why we're here talking today is that LIWAP needs to be stood up as a permanent low-income housing water assistance program. What we found out during the pandemic is that it's not about urban, it's not about rural, it's not about, it's everywhere. And surprisingly, we found out that there are a lot of zip codes beyond those areas that are within the federal poverty guidelines that really struggle with paying their water bill. And one of the things that I can tell you is disheartening is what we saw happen in Mississippi, Jackson, Mississippi, and what we saw earlier in Flint, Michigan. And there's dozens and dozens of cities like Flint and Jackson, Mississippi that are really struggling. And now's the time for it to stop. We need to make sure that as utilities, we can continue to provide safe, clean, and affordable drinking water. We have to make sure that we can work collaboratively with our communities to be able to provide service, whether it is through an emergency situation or a pandemic, or just on a day-to-day basis. Water is a human right, and we as utilities take that very seriously, and we are working not only at the water industry level, but we have been lobbying for some time now with Congress to be able to get not only funding for low-income water assistance, we also need more funding to support aging infrastructure. It is to a point now to where it is unsustainable for cities and local utilities and local ratepayers to continue to comply with ever-changing regulations and deal with the impact that climate change is providing in our communities and in our cities. So our call to action is basically utilities are willing to do our share, but we definitely need the federal government, we need Congress, and we need support to help us with aging infrastructure. We need help with assisting our customers with paying their bill, with standing up a permanent low-income assistance program for water. And we need funds to help us deal with emerging contaminants and also with climate change. And we are going to do our part. We're asking the federal government to do their part.
Thank you, Scott and Tony. Next, I have the great pleasure of inviting Kyle Jones from the Community Water Center in California.
Thanks, Yasmin. Good. Well, I guess in the West Coast, good morning, good afternoon for those in different time zones. My name is Kyle Jones. I'm the Policy and Legal Director with Community Water Center. Community Water Center is an organization that is focused on organizing, advocating, and delivering on community-driven drinking water solutions for rural communities in the Southern San Joaquin Valley and on the Central Coast of California. One of our first and biggest policy wins was actually the passage of the Human Right to Water in California a little over a decade ago to this year. And that recognized that safe and affordable water is a right of all in California. And we've done significant work making progress on trying to speed up how we're delivering water to rural communities and getting infrastructure built, thanks to the work that many of folks have worked on in getting the bipartisan infrastructure law passed. But there's been not enough focus on making sure that we're making water affordable for all. The vice president was actually in California recently talking about environmental justice and mentioned that environmental justice is access to clean water. And so for us, if we're not able to provide affordable water rates, then we're just going to be perpetuating injustices for those who are having to make difficult decisions to where they can't pay their water bills or risking getting shut off. And I wanted to explain a little bit about the situation on the ground in California. And you saw some residents in the video from the San Gerardo Cooperative. And this is a small farm worker cooperative near Salinas. It's about 60 homes. And historically, the community actually had fairly affordable water rates. They were paying about $20 a month for a fixed charge, and then slightly more based on how much each individual household consumed. Unfortunately, that rate was reflecting water that was unsafe to drink. The community is completely surrounded by industrial agriculture and faced contamination from nitrates and 1,2,3-TCP. And so in order to provide a treatment option for that community and get that community to a place where that water is safe to use, we were able to get treatment installed. But unfortunately, the fixed cost for those water rates went from being about $20 a month to $72 a month. And as folks were mentioning, they're now paying over $100 a month with combining their fixed rates and usage charge. You know, when we were in the community a couple of weeks ago, I was speaking with a woman who was just saying, you know, she's having to consciously think about how much is she watering her garden, which is something that she loves to do. And unfortunately, she's just has to walk by it and pretend that she doesn't see the plants dying because she's only able to afford to water once a week in the summer. And as Scott noted, there's a lot of local barriers to implement affordability on the state side. You know, many rural communities lack a ratepayer base that allow them to provide safe drinking water with affordable water rates. There's just not the economy of scale. And in many of these small systems, you know, you wouldn't believe how accounting and billing is done. In some systems, it's done by hand, bookkeeping done in Excel. So we're not talking about systems where we can simply mandate that they set up their own program and have it be a robust program. And if a system is entirely low income, there's just going to be no local source to support ratepayer assistance. We also have challenges in urban areas in California as well. A lot of that stemming from California's constitutional barrier that prevents the state from mandating low-income ratepayer assistance for water. We can't force ratepayers to subsidize other users of water. And this actually came to a head last year. Los Angeles Department of Water and Power had a low-income ratepayer assistance program that was actually successfully challenged and thrown out by a couple of ratepayers who didn't want their rates going to subsidizing low-income customers. And as a lot of folks explained, the affordability problem is only going to get worse. You know, we need to get the right infrastructure in place to deal with not only historic legacy contamination, but emerging contaminants like PFAS. And we also need to prepare water systems for climate change. It's been quite a while upon California. We're entering a third year of drought. And so in order to secure access to water for communities, it's going to be even harder as water rates as water supplies get more expensive. But the pandemic did show that states can make significant progress with federal help. Senator Padilla mentioned that California had over $1 billion in water debt accrued in 2021. And we were actually able to take $985 million of ARPA funds to pay down that debt that had accrued between March 2020 and June 2021. And I think, you know, for those of you who think, you know, can government work? Can government get this done? California Environmental Protection Agency was able to get $300 million out the door to pay down customer debt in under 6 months from having the law going into effect from creating the program, benefiting over 535,000 residential and commercial accounts. But, you know, you may note there's a discrepancy between that $300 million paid out and that $1 billion in debt. Some people paid down their debt, not knowing that they were getting relief, potentially having detrimental trade-offs. Other places, debt gets transferred. Debt got moved from water bill accounts to property tax rolls, then creating a lien on people's homes. Other times people got their debt sent to collection agencies where they're faced with impacts to their credit. And in this program, water systems just decided not to enroll, meaning that those customers weren't able to get relief. So where are we now in California? The shutoff moratorium is expired. Water debts are continuing to rise. LIWAP is rolling out too slow for many communities. One-time assistance or addressing just accruing the increasing debt is not enough. To provide real environmental justice, we need a long-term commitment to make water rates affordable. And that's why in California, Community Water Center has been working diligently to pass a low-income water rate assistance program. And last year, that was a form of SB 222. And this is a picture from one of the rallies we held in the Capitol in California. So as I mentioned, we've recognized the right to affordable water since 2013, but haven't done enough to make this a reality. And so we really wanted to set up our own program at the state level, get rid of all those barriers of water systems being too small, of getting around the Constitution by providing state funding to really help folks pay their bills. And we pulled from the lessons we learned from dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic and those debts to really think about what's the quickest way to help customers. So we were thinking about a program in which all water systems would be participating, really lowering the burden for customers to have to enroll, thinking about things like, can we auto-enroll people based on existing eligibility for other programs? And then providing direct credits for customer bills so that it was able to flow through their water rate system and they could see their rates go down from this program. And we had a lot of success. The bill made it all the way to the governor's desk. But unfortunately, we were vetoed. And that's because we didn't have funding for the program outlined. And as we go into this year and we think about how we're going to change things and how we're going to make affordability a reality, figuring out a system of funding is going to be critical. And, in California, we're going to try to do it alone if we can, but it's going to be difficult. I just saw about an hour ago, the Legislative Analyst Office just came out with a report, California. We are going to go from a $97.5 billion surplus last year to a $25 billion deficit this year. And so we're going to try, but without federal help, it's going to be very difficult to make sure that affordability for water rates is accessible for all Californians. It's a human right. We can't only promise clean water to those who make money. And states can't do this on their own. If the wealthiest state in the country is struggling, is unable to make sure this is happening, the federal government will need to help. Thank you.
Thanks, Kyle. All right, a few takeaways that we hope that you walk away from today's call with. Number one, as Ms. Monica has mentioned multiple times, debt assistance is not the same as water affordability. We need to be working on both. And both Monica and Kyle mentioned, and several other speakers had mentioned that debt assistance is a Band-Aid, but it's a necessary Band-Aid. So as Julian and Tony had both mentioned, our water infrastructure is old and failing. We need commitment from the federal government to upgrade our water infrastructure, and we need time to be able to meet the existing demands and the growing threats from climate change in a way that ensures that water is affordable to every family in the United States. So while we are upgrading water infrastructure within this country, we need to stand up a permanent national low-income water assistance program to make sure that no family loses access to water, as Sonia had highlighted earlier, or has to make that impossible decision between paying for water or paying for their groceries. The third takeaway is, I hope you see from sort of the lineup today is that different parts of the water sector, communities, nonprofits, utilities are coming here today together to ask the federal government for help. And we don't always see this kind of alignment across issues. So this is something to take note of. So with that, I'm going to take some time to go through some of the questions and answers. We'll start with the question from Rosemary, which is, what is the thinking about how to tackle the issue of providing assistance to renters who don't have accounts with the water provider and pay for utility services through their rent? I'm going to turn it over to Scott and then maybe Monica.
Yeah, I mean,
that's the $1 million question, right? Is how do you tackle the renter deal? And that's a program design question rather than like should we have a national permanent program? And I don't think like if we can't solve the renter problem, then that means we can't have a national program. I don't think that's the case. Like I think there may be other ways to solve the rent problem or the renter problem, I guess I should say, whether they may be housing based, right? Because most of the times, for folks not familiar, for folks that are renters, the water bill ultimately gets folded into the monthly rent that they pay. And so sometimes it's tough to be like, oh, well, our water bill is this much or that much. And so it's harder to, and they don't have a direct account with the utility. So it's harder to do specific debt relief for a particular household when they're renting. That said, like I said, I think there may be better tools than a national water bill assistance program, since these people don't have a water bill, that may make sure that water bill assistance doesn't just become, a direct handout to landlords, and that never goes to actually like paying down the water debt that exists at utilities. And those things may be like rental assistance programs or renter rights programs that help make sure that renters are protected around like housing policy mechanisms or levers to pull there.
And Ms. Monica?
No, I think you're right on, Scott, that it is more of a design issue. And one of the things that we've been able to see instituted here in Detroit is that through cooperation with the water department, we were able to educate them that people were falling through the cracks. They were then able to put in place a form. So any landlord that is receiving services through the city of Detroit to their particular property, they have to sign an agreement along with the renter that they are responsible for that water debt. And that has been a really good instrument to use to create accountability and clear transparency in terms of who's responsible.
Yeah, it definitely can be done.
Yes. And then also the community action agencies, they can play a significant role in making sure that there's some transparency and accountability in terms of who's receiving the resources.
All right, thank you both. One of the questions that came up a few times, both in what you said and in the chat, is why can't we leave states and utilities to do this on their own? So I'm going to turn it over, Scott, to you and Tony to answer that question of states and utilities, and then Kyle, if you want to build again from California.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you heard from all of us that states can't do this by themselves. They don't have the infrastructure to do it by themselves. Most states have balanced budget amendments, and so they're in smaller affordability type programs often get tossed out, at the slightest chance of an imbalanced budget, and states in general just there can be many legal policy barriers. You heard some of the ones that Kyle talked about, but in most states, it's really unclear if customer assistance programs can happen in a fully automated way as well as we would envision them, or in the scope that we would want them to. And so it's not just a problem that can be solved by states working with utilities by themselves.
And I would just add that utilities have the capability of being able to administer programs that we have in place already. But when you think about the LIHWAP program, it just makes a lot of sense, since that funding currently for LIHEAP, for example, goes through our city community action group. It makes more sense for us to allow that same group to administer the LIHWAP program for synergies, and also we can develop a partnership with those folks, because they have information from whether it be senior citizens or through others through the LIHEAP program that will match the LIHWAP program. And so it makes a lot of sense for us to partner with those community agencies. The problem is the need is much larger than the pool of resources than we have received from the federal government. And this temporary program needs to be fully funded, and it needs to be extended as a permanent program.
Yeah, and I think I just build upon Scott's answer there. It's about the resources for a lot of us. Even if we could solve all the legal barriers and just program, we just don't have the resources to make it happen. And as we enter a period of potential recession, the state budget with the balanced budget amendment in California, it's going to get even worse potentially at a time when need for assistance is going to increase. And so there's just a mismatch between when resources and need occur. And so having the federal government be able to be a backstop to provide the necessary funding to make sure that programs are set up and are sustainable is critical.
Miss Monica, I see your hand up. Did you want to add to that?
No, just adding to what Tony and Kyle have already stressed, to give people just sort of a microscopic look at what's happening on the ground. Detroit is looking at about 20 to 30,000 households that if we cannot come up with a sustained method for being able to keep their water on, they will have no alternative but to be in a state of water shutoffs. The other thing that's going to be a serious burden for us is that right now, even with the funding that's coming through LIWAP, it's only enough funding for 18 months for those 20,000 households. So we're going to be back in this revolving state of water shutoffs again. And so we'll be back to your doors pleading. But the other thing that we'll be concerned about is another wave of public health impacts. So this is why there's such an urgency in all of our voices with making sure that the plan is sustained.
Thank you, Ms. Monica. All right, there's a question in here from Melissa. Are there any discussions or insights around what measurable thresholds defines the human right to water? Is there a per capita daily volume? Does this account for water heating as well? Kyle, or California, and I'm going to turn this over to you.
So we haven't explicitly said like what is the per capita gallons per day that defines the human right to water. It's enough for cooking, for sanitation, for cleaning, for all the things people need to do to thrive. We have in California, though, thought about thinking about targets and goals for water conservation. And that's just due to our, as a state in the West, we need to conserve water to make sure that there's just enough to go around. And so I believe the most recent iteration in legislation is going to be seeking a target in a few years of 42 gallons per capita per day for indoor consumption. That would be for all uses. But I think that's to say especially on a national level what a target would be, it'd probably be too difficult to do at this stage, given there's just a diverse needs for diverse communities.
Ms. Monica, anything to add?
Yes, I think that this is the point too, to Kyle's point, where this is why there's necessary funding to be able to help utilities be able to provide the data and the analysis that is needed to make sure that we're properly funding the necessary investment in infrastructure and water affordability. So these are part of the sort of the chicken and the egg kinds of scenarios that we want to be able to solve very quickly over the next 10 to 12 months in making sure that we are moving the country towards sustained water affordability and not still using the excuse that we just don't know who's shut off or how many people need this service. So those are ways to move the country in a collaborative, collective trajectory to make sure we're solving the problem.
Thank you both. All right, there's a question addressed to Scott. As LIWAP's low income eligibility has overlap with those customers receiving LIHEAP assistance, how specifically is the fragmented network hampering assistance distribution? And what have been effective tactics that have enabled some states to get their funds to eligible households fast, like Kentucky or North Carolina, while others are distributing slowly?
So the second half of the question about tactics, particularly since Kentucky is one of those ones, I'm going to let Tony take that piece because I think he's got a good idea of what good has been done by LIWAP, and maybe Kyle, given that California is one of the ones that have been really slow to do LIWAP, there may be some opportunities there. But in terms of like why fragmentation has been a barrier, like I said, the LIWAP program is largely based on kind of a copy paste of the LIHEAP program, which is designed for electrical and natural gas utilities. So like every single one of those utilities to get LIHEAP money has to opt into the program and then become part of the system. And then they get a direct credit back on bills. there's so many more of those kinds of agreements you have to do with water. Because if you, even in a state like, pick a state, it probably has a couple of hundred natural gas and electric utilities. It's not that difficult over a course of a couple of years to get agreements with a majority of those utilities as vendors and kind of get that system built in so that their customers can apply for bill assistance. Setting that up at the water system scale is so much harder because you have to have agreements with every single one of those utilities. And there are plenty of states where a lot of utilities are not opting into that, and a lot of people are left uncovered as a result because this program is a temporary program. A lot of folks are like, I'm not going to go through all of the paperwork and all of the I don't have the capacity to go and create the agreement with a bill sharing back to the state, and so a lot of people are left uncovered. And I think that's one of the biggest problems that fragmentation has with this system, is that it's designed in such a way that particularly if you have lots and lots of small utilities, big well-populated but rural states, say Texas, for example, or some of the Midwestern states, Missouri, or even some of the places that have higher capacity, higher service connections utilities, but are generally lower capacity because they have much more aging systems, and that's where their focus is around regulatory stuff. Affordability is just not part of their thing, so it leaves a lot of people uncovered. But I will turn it over to my friends from Kentucky and California to talk about kind of a pros and cons approach of the tactics those states have put in.
From the Kentucky perspective, we're very fortunate being in Louisville, being the largest city and the largest utility in the state, and being able to collaborate with the state with the LIHEAP program already being administered through the Community Resiliency Program or department. In the previous COVID relief and the previous ARPA funds were also distributed through the Community Resilience and then to the Louisville Water Foundation. So we already had the mechanism set up. It was just a matter of deciding and developing those relationships with Community Resiliency to have them to be able to administer the LIHEAP program. And as you mentioned, Scott, if you were already signed up in LIHEAP, you automatically were able to be eligible for LIWAP. And then you're also eligible for any other assistance that may be out there coming from the community, or assistance that may be coming directly from the utilities themselves. So that's how we were able to coordinate that, and that's why it was very effective.
Yeah, I think in California, it's like Scott mentioned, a lot of fragmentation. We have over 3,000 water systems in the state. I'm guessing there's nowhere near a tenth of that in as far as energy systems, and a lot of those systems aren't, it's not like we have a few municipals where they're doing energy and water, and so it's easier for them to be able to access the programs. But for some of these smaller water districts, it's just difficult to not only know about LIWAP, but also then go through the process of engaging. I mean, there's a system we work with in Tulare County in the San Joaquin Valley where up until about a month ago or so, they didn't even have a quorum on their board. So how could they even then take the action to then start and direct staff to begin engaging in this process? And so there's just a lot of challenges with that program that we're experiencing that, hopefully can over time, if something gets set up, be addressed to make sure that those funds can get out the door as quickly as possible.
All right, thank you all. All right, there's a question in here that says, here in Toledo, our utility director believes one long-term solution to offsetting the costs for improvements to water infrastructure is for a federal water tax to be implemented similar to what is done for gas. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Scott, we'll turn it over to you first.
Well, that's a blast from the past, the old national water tax. I haven't heard about that one in a while, but so couple of thoughts. So Congressional Research Service actually published a study on this, I want to say back in 2009. There's a lot of things to think about when you're talking about a national water tax. I mean, first is, if you look at the national gas tax, that is, if I'm not mistaken, probably the single most unpopular tax in America, both politically and on an individual household scale. And you're talking about replicating that model. There's going to be a huge uphill battle, both in Congress and with people to sort of accept that. And like the gap in funding, as we talked about, I think Julian mentioned earlier, the annual gap is still going to end up growing, and it's about $109 billion a year. So if you're going to like tax households to the tune of $109 billion a year annually to help close that gap, that's a pretty significant financial burden on top of what everybody already has to pay. And that's part of what makes it politically unpopular. Also, one of the things that study pointed out is that utilities all bill differently, right? You know, some of them are monthly, some quarterly, some do it volumetrically, some do it with inclining block rates, some do it on income-based rates. So it was really, really hard to figure out how to add a national water tax onto water bills because there's so many different systems across the country. And this is another one of those places where like fragmentation makes everything in the water sector harder. This would be one of those implementation problems where it's like you've got 50,000 plus different actors, all with completely different ways that they manage their systems. It was really hard to figure out. And, you know, just as an aside, but like consumption taxes in general aren't exactly equitable, right? Like it's easier to swallow on something like fuel, where there are viable alternatives to consuming fuel, like transit or biking or walking or something, but there is no viable alternative to consuming water, right? You must consume water to live. And so having that consumption tax on something that a lot of people have talked about as being a human right is just a real clash of values, I think, in a lot of ways. And it really disproportionately affects people that already can't pay to afford their water. And so you're adding this sort of national tax on top of that. And so you're really asking people to pay for water twice, both with the rates from their, you know, on their water bills, water and wastewater bills, and then more on with a national tax on top of that, unless you're talking about like completely getting rid of all local water rates and substituting it with a national tax. And I just think that is a system that would be much too difficult to implement as a way to pay for water infrastructure across the country. So there's almost no way to determine from a totally national scale which places get funded and by how much, right? Like that, there's too many actors in this space to be able to actually equitably distribute a national water tax if you make that the complete substitution for the water rates model. It was an interesting thought experiment though back in the early mid 2010s. Somebody did say national wipes tax, which I absolutely agree with that one. Wipes are a scourge.
All right, we've got a question here from Megan. What aspects of the federal government's budget will need to be reevaluated so we can properly fund water infrastructure and water affordability? Anyone want to answer this one?
I can start and others chime in, but honestly, just more federal funding to water infrastructure to the level of what you've seen in the infrastructure package is one of the best ways to help solve affordability. Like one of the biggest drivers of affordability is the fact that our infrastructure is so aging, and we have to, and Tony talked about this, from his perspective, but we have to keep making sure that our infrastructure is up to snuff, and also that it meets the regulatory requirements that we have so that people are drinking safe and affordable water. Like those are the things that must drive utilities, and that what drives unaffordability is our inability to actually pay for those systems. And the more and more that burden has fallen on ratepayers, and if the federal government were to step in, that would reduce some of that burden and start moving away from some of the driver of unaffordable water. That would be one of the ways that I would rejigger the federal budget. It's just more money for water and wastewater infrastructure. But Monica's got her hand up. I want to hear what she has to say.
No, thank you, Scott. Totally agree. I think one of the ways that we help reframe it in terms of our local conversations was from the perspective that my mother shares. She's a retired master sergeant from the U.S. military. Still at 76 years old, she can be called up by her government because she can set up an emergency response unit in a war zone. And one of the things she talked to me about is the fact that according to the Geneva Convention, you cannot deny your enemy access to water even in times of war. And so that, to me, if we begin to look at water and water infrastructure and properly funding water access, water affordability in this nation, if we would look at it as a national security issue, which it is, if we don't have proper funding, sanitation, accessibility, then what we find is there is a public health fallout from that. It creates chaos, it creates confusion, people are displaced, So all of those things are things that don't bode well if you're just looking at it from the model of good quality health, good community synergy, ways to invite more business and opportunities into a community. We've got to look at it from that perspective. And being able to keep water on actually is a revenue generator. We don't talk enough about that. And so those are some of the narrative shaping situations that we really hope that collectively we can be a part of, is shifting the conversation from what we can't do to how we must do in this moment. We must put the U.S. on a track of being able to afford clean, safe, affordable water. There's no other alternative.
Thank you, Ms. Monica and Scott. All right, there's a question here. Have any localities seen increases in affordability as a result of programs that use treated wastewater being pumped into underground aquifers? Kyle, can I turn that over to you?
Yeah, I guess I don't know of any specifically, but it would depend on a number of factors. What is that water replacing? If you're able to create a local source of water that's offsetting, say, imported water and doing it at a rate that's less expensive than the imported water, then theoretically you're able to reduce rates on customers. And there's ways to design infrastructure projects in ways that help those at the lower income if done correctly. Some of the more progressive systems in California recognize that for some of their more expensive water projects, if they're having to do things like water recycling, that the increase in rates commensurate with those projects then fall on the higher those who use more water, or who generally are the folks who have larger lots, bigger lawns, higher income folks. So, I think any infrastructure project has the potential to help with water rates if, as folks mentioned, we're providing enough federal or state assistance to make sure that those overall costs of doing the needed infrastructure to get water to people's homes is lower overall.
Yeah, I think the economics of this only makes sense in a place where water is scarce and thus more expensive, right? Like you have a place like Tucson, Arizona, for example, is doing groundwater recharge largely to help them, to insulate them from future climate change and future droughts so that they have an adequate aquifer water supply in a world where the Colorado River goes dry one year, or there's a persistent drought that lasts a year. So you've got this sort of like a groundwater bank essentially underneath the city that they can use and keep water rates more affordable during times when there may not be as available. But I think that's the only kinds of places where the economics make sense.
All right, we're going to ask one more question and then I'm going to turn it over to each of our amazing panelists just to give one talking point that they really hope you all hear from what they've mentioned today. There's this last question that just came in on affordability. So what do you each think is the current best practice in measuring affordability of water sewer service at the local level? How is this being aligned with prioritization of resources from the bipartisan infrastructure law and other federal funding? So there's a little bit of two questions in there of how do we measure affordability? What is affordable when we're talking about the local level? And then the second question of what are we doing in terms of prioritizing our federal resources? Anyone want to start?
I can start. When you think about affordability, historically, utilities, we always know that US EPA has sort of affordability guidelines that they look at when they determine how much you can afford to do with capital improvements under a regulatory requirement. And so that's, you shouldn't be spending more than 2% of the median household income. And that's sort of that affordability guideline that we use. But the one thing that we learned is in conjunction with LIWAP is, the federal poverty guideline, anything above or below 140, 150% of the federal poverty guideline, obviously, if it's more than 1% of your income, it could be unaffordable. And so we try to use that as a barometer. We also try to measure and compare ourselves with peer cities with same situational issues that we're dealing with from a utility perspective to kind of gauge our priorities in terms of how much can we spend in any given year on capital, and what is that going to do to our rates, and is our rates going to be higher than the annual rate of inflation? Those type of things are the parameters that we look at when we try to set rates and when we try to determine if they're going to be affordable for our community.
I could add, in California, we passed the Safe and Affordable Drinking Water Fund. And as part of that process, we are working on a series of metrics to come up with better definitions for defining when water rates are unaffordable for communities. It's really challenging, I think, with particularly in a world of where income inequality is such a problem that it is. It's really hard to rely on things, to just use metrics based on, what's median income. And additionally, if you have places where, all things being equal, one community is more, the housing costs are much more higher than the other community, then it becomes that much harder for that community to pay water bills than others. So we're working in California to come up with a series of metrics that can help define and decide what makes water affordable or unaffordable. But I think it's going to take some time and work and engagement with communities on the ground to really understand the scope of the problem and help define it.
I can try and tackle the second part of the question, which is around prioritization of bipartisan infrastructure law funds. And so the majority of the funds that go out from the bipartisan infrastructure law to water infrastructure, of that $55 billion, I think there's over 40 of that billion, I think maybe even 45 of it, I don't remember the exact number, but goes out through the state revolving fund methods, which is a mechanism by which the federal government puts a little bit of seed money in to each state's state revolving fund, and then they loan that money out to localities who pay that back over the course of 25, 30 years at very favorable rates. So this is a long established mechanism that exists for putting money into the water and wastewater sector. But a couple of things, in fact, they're mostly loans, and about half of the money that's going out through the bipartisan infrastructure law has to go out as grants or principal forgiveness, and I'll get to that in a second. But so majority of this is going to be loans. So that's part of the prioritization process. And the other part of the prioritization process is that every single state that has these sort of programs gets to set its own prioritization process, right? So every state will be different in terms of how it figures out which of the long list of projects that every state gets in any particular year, which ones are the ones that get the annual allotted amount of funding. It's different in every state. I mentioned that about 49% of some of that money has to go out as grants or principal forgiveness, which is sort of like the loans version of grants. And the way state law and federal law is written is that money has to go towards what are called disadvantaged communities, which is another state-defined term. So state gets to define what a disadvantaged community is. So that definition will be different across all different kinds of states. Some states have a really simple definition, like any community under 10,000 is a disadvantaged community. Others have more complex calculations that are involved in terms of like what happens to a disadvantaged community. And EPA has started to issue some guidance to require states to start thinking about, like, is there a particular set of goals in mind for the state, or is it just like small communities are disadvantaged, like they're trying to discourage folks away from those sort of simple definitions and make them more like goal oriented, like we want our disadvantaged community definition to reduce racial disparity in water infrastructure funding or something like that. They're really encouraging that. But as it stands, the prioritization process is not necessarily connected to best practices in measuring affordability at a national scale, because much of that determination happens at the state scale. I hope that answered the question.
Thanks, Scott. The only thing I'll add to that is that it will become a big state game. So Monica with We the People of Detroit is doing a lot of advocacy work on state revolving funds in Michigan, along with many others. Kyle with Community Water Center in California is also doing the advocacy work. So please do learn about state revolving funds and help us figure out how to make sure they go out to the communities that need them the most. All right, we have 5 minutes left. I'm going to turn it over to each of you. What do you want folks to walk away with from this conversation? So Tony, I'll start with you, then I'll go to Scott, Kyle, and end with Miss Monica.
Well, I think that my takeaway or walk away comment would be LIWAP is a necessary program. LIWAP is a program that has been very helpful to so many people in our community. It is a program that is definitely needed to be permanently installed and funded and resourced. And I think that, you know, the major elephant in the room that's driving up affordability and rates to customers is aging infrastructure. And we must do more. We need more from Congress to be able to deal with that. $55 billion is great. But as someone showed on their slide, the need is about $109 billion for the next 20 years. So that was just a drop in the bucket to dealing with infrastructure needs and rates to our local community.
So +1, definitely agree with that. But I also think, like, you know, in addition to, we need a national permanent water bill assistance program. I think the one takeaway I would have folks understand is this is a huge, tremendous alignment opportunity, not just, you know, to align the federal, state, and local approaches on affordability, but also to align the federal, state, and local approaches on infrastructure. These are opportunities to prioritize the kinds of infrastructure that we need to help reduce that aging infrastructure pressure that Tony just talked about. If we're prioritizing the kind of infrastructure there, that we can start creating some actual affordable, we can create infrastructure to kind of reduce that need a little bit. But at the same time, we can also start to align the different parts of the water sector around things like affordability. This is a tremendous opportunity. You're seeing it right here, right now, with community action groups, nonprofits like PolicyLink and U.S. Water Alliance, utilities, and everybody in between aligning around saying we must have a national permanent water bill assistance program. That's another tremendous alignment opportunity to get all of these sort of voices together as part of the water sector.
Thanks, Scott. Kyle?
Yeah, I mean, what everyone's saying, right? We, you know, if water truly is a human right, then we need to commit as a society to make it affordable so that people aren't left without because of their means of the situation. It's unconscionable. And I think we just need a commitment from all levels of the government, from the federal government, the state governments, and the local water agencies to get this done so that we don't have to deal with situations where, like we were in the pandemic, with debts increasing and shutoffs increasing. We need to keep people able to thrive. Communities and families, if they don't have access to clean, safe drinking water, they're not able to thrive. They're not able to be viable. And so we need to make that happen.
Thanks, Kyle. And Ms. Monica.
No, thank you so much. And just want to ditto everything that we've heard. I think the Southern Baptist in me wants to just say amen right now. But part of what we know too is that this is one of those issues that can unite us, as you're hearing from all of my colleagues across the board. This has the ability. Water is a uniter. We all, regardless of what our political or religious ideologies and affiliations are, we cannot make it without this life-sustaining force. And I'm so excited about what Scott said. It is a moment for us to align and get something done for the American people. And it will actually build bridges instead of walls. So we're excited to be a part of that.
Thank you, Ms. Monica. I'm sure folks are clapping in the audience, even though we can't see them. Thank you all for joining us today. We're just going to end. Someone had asked for a reiteration of some of our walkways. So I hope what you heard is that we have to make sure that water is affordable for every family in the United States. Water is a human right. That from what you saw on the panel today, NGOs, communities, and utilities in the water sector are coming together and aligning to ask the federal government for sustained help. And this extends beyond the bipartisan infrastructure law. The assistance and affordability are not the same. We need both of them. Our water infrastructure is old and failing. So we need time and funding to improve and update our water infrastructure and to meet the existing demand and growing threats from climate change. And finally, that we need a permanent national low-income water assistance program to make sure that no family loses access to their water or has to make the impossible decision between paying for water or groceries. Thank you again for those of you that joined. We will send out a recording along with the very short 2-page brief on why water affordability matters. Thank you again to the incredible panelists that joined us today. Hope to hear from our attendees later. All right, bye everyone.